Hazel Tindall, and welcome to this online class. I've chosen to knit a bookmark for this class, something like this, but what I'm working on for you to see is slightly bigger than this because this is really tiny. Now the reason I choose a bookmark is it's not a very big project, and people tell me that they like to go home from a workshop with something that's finished. So this is doable in 3 hours, but it has quite a lot to it because you're knitting in the round, and this is another bookmark that's not quite finished, but it's knitted in the round, so you get practice at going round in circles or an oval. Then you have to cut your knitting, so this bit's been cut, and then you have to learn how to finish the edges. So it's a little project, but there's quite a lot in it. And at the end of it, you have a finished, usable bookmark, because we all still like books, fortunately. So it starts with 41 stitches, and I always use a long tail cast on, because that's the first one I learned, and I really only use about maybe 3 different cast-ons, so I believe there's a whole lot more. It's nice to use what's in your head. And a lot of people wonder, how do you know how long this tail has to be? Well, I found that this is about 30 stitches, fingertip to elbow. But I have short arms, so you'll find out for yourself. So I want 41 stitches, so that's my 30 plus a little bit more. Then I make a loop over my finger, and this would be stitch 1, and get that on the needle. And then it's just a case of round the thumb and make the stitch. And this is just all very repetitive. And I'll go slowly so you have a chance to see. I always knit with the yarn in my right hand. It's how I learned. So I catch the new stitch with my thumb as soon as it's been knitted. And I find this is a really easy cast on to use. And I usually find it the quickest one. Now you can, I know a lot of people knit with the yarn in their left hand and they cast on, but everything is happening in one hand. And I always find that the thumb yarn gets loose, whereas if you have the yarn in your right hand as well as your left hand, things are pulling in opposite directions and you don't get this same looseness. And I'm not very good at using my left hand for that, so I'll go back to the right hand. And I don't know how many stitches I've got, so I'll have to pause and count in a moment. And one way to count, when I was little we learned to count in 2s, so we went 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, but it's also quick to count in 5, so I would touch the 3 and go like that, and that would be 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, that was 42, that was a lucky guess. So now we're ready to do the first row of moss stitch, also known as seed stitch. I always have an odd number of stitches for moss stitch, because it means that if you're doing lots of rows, you know that every row is going to start with a knit, and you're not having to stop and look and wonder. So that's why I will always have a an odd number for moss stitch. So I'm doing a knit one and a purl one. And the first row, in Shetland it's known as the swearing, is always slower because the stitches are a bit tighter. So it's just 1 and 1. So you start with doing 3 rows of moss stitch. So this is row 1 done, and then I just turn the work and start on row 2. And you can see this one's a bit quicker. So now I've got all 3 rows done, and we're ready now for the increase row. I always do an increase row after doing the edging, because the Fair Isle, the colour work tends to pull in a bit. So you want the extra stitches to compensate for any pulling in. And in this one, the pattern says knit 1, and then knit 3, and make 1. And you repeat the 3, make 1 till you get to the end. And you can make 1 any way you want. You can go in to the bar between the stitches in the row below and knit into the back. This is not my favourite way. And I'll do another 1, 2, 3. And I can make a stitch by knitting into the back of the 3rd stitch, and that's my preferred method. I'll show you that one again. 1, 2, and then the 3rd one I'm going to go into front and back. So the gap between the new stitches is always 3. Another way to make an increase is a backwards loop, and that works okay, but it can be a bit tight when you come to knit it next time. So I'm just going to stick with knitting into the front and the back. And at the end I should have 4 stitches so that we have symmetry with the beginning. I like that as much as possible. And I now have 53 stitches, and I'm just about ready to knit in the round. So I'm going to split these stitches over 2 needles. And that's about half on each needle. So it's ready to go round and round. But the first thing you have to do is add on some extra stitches, a bridge between the 2 halves, and this is called a, well, it was never called a steek but in Shetland, but it seems to have become a word that's accepted worldwide as being this extra stitches, the bridge between the 2 pieces of knitting which you then cut open. And I use a backwards loop, and I'm going to put on 5 here. 3. And then I need another needle here, and I'm going to put on 4 here on this new needle. So that's the extra stitches cast on. And then I'm looking at row 1 of the chart, and the first one is a background colour. And then I get the pattern colour, and I've chosen this bright blue for this, and I have the pattern colour in my left hand, and this end doesn't want to be too long. And this row is just 1 and 1, so you're doing 1 with the light colour and 1 with the dark colour. And I always have the pattern colour, that's the colour making the shape, in my left hand. And it is very fiddly, these small number of stitches. And as soon as possible I've got my fingers into the middle, and I'm ignoring the needle that's not being used, it just hangs down. So when I turn the corner, I keep this colour on my finger. I don't have to take that colour off at all. And as I go around this corner, I'm making sure these stitches are quite close to the other needle. So the spare needle is coming out in this space here. And there's no big gap here. And again, as soon as possible, I'm getting my fingers into the centre. So it's very little movement, and the stitches are all near the point of the needle. So I've got the left thumb is feeding the stitches and the right thumb is catching the new one. Now when you get here, this is the cast on stitches. They can be a bit tight and awkward. So here in the steek, the bit you're going to cut, it's just 1 and 1 again, right to the end. And that's the first bit, so that's this little bit here. This pattern of 1 and 1 is what my mother used to call mice teeth. I don't know why, but that was just what she called it. And once I've finished this row, I'll break this yarn because I'm not going to need it again for a few rows. So I just let that hang, and then I've got a plain row. And I'm leaving this colour at the centre of the steek. And that way, when you cut it open, it'll just fall off. And so you don't need a long end, you're not going to be weaving it in. And again, these first stitches are a bit tricky. So this is just a single colour row. And every stitch is with the light colour. And so you can see that this small number of stitches is not the easiest to work with. And I always recommend people that want to get going with knitting Fair Isle should go for something bigger. A headband is a really good thing to start with because there's no shaping to worry about and it's not a huge project, but you have enough time to get into the rhythm of knitting. And you can see that the third needle here I'm not touching at all, it's just hanging loose. And I really don't concern myself with that at all. And when I'm coming here, I make sure this first 2 stitches are quite tight to go around the corner. So when I've got my fingers in here, this needle is just outside my hand. It's not in the palm at all. And it can be tricky when you come to the end of the row. So now we're ready to go on to putting some colour into this little diamond. And you can see here and here that this is the same pattern, and it looks entirely different when you put different colours in. And this is another one. And another one, and they all look different. It's all exactly the same pattern. Here, when I've done the 1 and 1 row, the contrast thread has become the background, so that can change it too. This one, I've actually put an extra row in here so that the green has carried on 1 row after the 1 and 1 with the white, and then I've changed the background to a yellow. This one hasn't got a lot of colour in it, but to me the important thing is always to see the pattern, the shape that you're doing. If there's a shape to be made, I think you need to see it. But that's just my opinion. This one is just 2 colours. If you're new to using colour knitting, trying colour knitting, then 2 colours is enough to begin with. And I would suggest that when you're choosing colours, if you decide just have a plain background, 1 background colour, and then you can change the pattern colours. Choosing colours is one of the hard things to do. So I've brought along a few here, and you need to think of your knitting as painting a landscape. Is it going to be a light background or a dark background? I would separate the colours into lights and darks. So for example, in this lot, I would say these are all maybe dark. This is definitely a dark. This is probably on the darkest shade. So let's say we're going to have a light background. So these could all be the light colours. These would be the dark colours. Now if I really, really wanted to use this colour and this colour, this is quite a big difference in value. So I would want something to go in between to soften that blow. I hope you can see that. But this sort of makes it a gentler change. Now you don't have a lot of room for experimenting with colour in a pattern just this big. And again, if you want it to go, if you want it to really, really want it to use this too, they're okay. But I would probably want something in between to make it a more gentle transition. I probably wouldn't use the green at all, because I don't use green much, but what would work better with this one would be this one, and again I'd probably go for the blue, because you're getting a gentle movement from colour to colour. So let's say we're going to use this 3 for the pattern, and I would use them either here to here or here to here. I wouldn't go this way. And if we had the background colours, these don't go very well with this lot, but if I had this too, now I would say this is light to dark, although you could argue with me on that one. But here I would say this was lighter and this was darker. So you always put your lightest light with your lightest dark. and your darkest light with your darkest dark. Does that make sense? I hope it does. Because if you do it the other way around, you don't have enough contrast. There's probably enough contrast there, but there's not a lot of contrast there. And one way to see how much contrast there is to take the yarns and just twist them together. And if you can't see clearly which is which, you're not going to have enough contrast. Whereas if you have the yellow and blue, this is the most difficult thing to try to explain, but if you have the yellow and blue, you can more easily see which is which there, so they would work better. But never be afraid of contrast. It looks better with bigger contrast than little contrast. But it's a case of practicing and looking to see what other people do. And explaining about colour is really, really tricky. But this is a cardigan that I made years ago. I'll just show you the back because the front is maybe needing mending. But here I used a dark grey background, and I was using tiny little balls of yarn, and I tried to make each one different. Now some of them I think work okay, but I've followed the rule more or less all the way up. I've started with the lighter colour and gone to a darker or a brighter colour. This one, there's 3 colours. I've gone from light to darker to the darkest or the brightest. With this star, I've got a really bright green to begin with, and then it's gone to a paler green and a darker green, and this bright one is coming again in the middle. And that's something I do sometimes to bring it all together. This one, on the other hand, I've gone from a pale lilac to a stronger one to another purplish one, and then I've gone to a pale pink in the middle. And I think that just doesn't work. There's too much contrast between the colour before and the centre colour. So that's one I don't like. The rest are not too bad. But again, this is another one that I did where I've done the bright peach at the start, and then it's come back in the middle. So you kind of need to get waves of, it needs to change, transition gently. And I have one more. This one, I've changed both the background and the pattern colours. So I've got quite a dark pattern colour here that goes along with quite a dark background colour. And one thing I very rarely do is change both the background and the pattern in the same row. I think it looks, it can break the pattern if you change them both in one row. And for this, and gradually this background colour has got lighter into the middle. And the pattern colour, at the same time as the background has got lighter, the pattern has got lighter. And I hope that helps explain a little bit about colour. So for this bookmark, I've chosen this bright blue for the edge because I don't have very much of it. And then for the next pattern, the little diamonds, I'm using this too. So I'm starting with the lighter of the two and moving to the darker. And then across the middle, I've decided I'll put this bright one, just to give it a little oomph, and you'll see how it looks. So I'm ready now to do the next chart row. So when I start the new colour, I just knot them together. And I try to use the yarn from the middle, but it's not always a good idea. There we go. And I can never remember the name of the knot, but I go, as long as you get them tied together, but you don't actually have to tie them together. And I like to get the knot fairly tight up against. It just means you don't have any loose stitches. Now I've knitted this so often that I can manage without the pattern, the chart to look at. So this is the stick stitches, so it's one light, one dark, and one light, one dark. And I always like the stick to be in straight lines. It means that you can easily see where to cut when you're going to cut. And then I like a dark stitch here, and then the first stitch on the body, the main part, is the opposite colour. And then it's 2 dark and 2 light and 3 dark. And there's a really nice rhythm to this pattern because it's 2 and 3 for row 1. So it's just 2 and 3 all the way around. And I think that sometimes you can look at charts too much and you don't understand what you're knitting, as well as if you just look at a piece of knitting and see the pattern, see the rhythm. And the best way to learn a pattern is actually to sit and dot it out on square paper yourself. So I did 1 there, so I'm going to do 2 here. And I'm pulling this 2 fairly tight. Now what you have to be careful here is you have 3 stitches in blue in a row. You have to make sure they're not too tight. So they need room to go around the corner. So that's the only bit you need to be careful with. So it's 2 and 3. And then in row 2, once you get it established, it's 2 and 2 and 1 and 2 and 2 and 1. And then the following row you're back to 3 and 2, but they're opposite colours. So it's finding the rhythm, and finding the rhythm is always easier if you have a bigger number of stitches. So that's row 1 done, the pattern set, as we say. And so we're ready for the next row. For this I'm going to do 2 rows with this colour, then 1 row with this colour, and then this 2 across the middle, and then it reverses out the way. So you can see there's always plenty of contrast. So you don't really want to see me knitting all the rows, so we'll skip to the top of the pattern now. Now here we are at the top of the pattern. I've done the whole pattern, and you can see I've gone from the lighter blue to the darker blue, and then the lemon has gone in across the middle row. And then I've used the same bright blue up here. And there's a knit row afterwards. And so this is coming to the end of the knit row. Earlier on I forgot to put in markers, but markers are not something I tend to use an awful lot. But I did put in a marker here because the instruction says knit to the marker. So I'm going to slip this marker off. The marker is just a piece of yarn that I've tied in a knot and slipped on the needle. And that's the cheapest stitch markers that I know of. And so now I'm going to cast off these extra stitches. So we have 5 here to cast off. So that's 1, 2, 3, And that's 4 gone. And I just need to carry on with this row, with this half of the steek. So that was 4, and this is number 5 going. 6, 7, and that's 8 stitches cast off. This was the edge of the steek, and that's the marker. But this is still a steek stitch here, so I have to knit this one and then cast off. And I'm now going to do a decrease row. So it's 1, 2, and 2 together. And it's 2 and 2 together right to the end. And you always have a plain row between Fair Isle and the decreasing. So you need one plain row. So this has actually got one row above the Fair Isle that isn't below it, but it's not. It's never an exact science, and it isn't that obvious. So it's 2 and 2 together all the way around. And I actually want to knit the top on one needle. So this is quite a good time to stop and cut the knitting. And I'll just pull these ends tight. Now this is the steek stitches. Here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 dark and 1, 2, 3, 4 light. So this is the center stitch here, and this is what I'm going to cut. So I just go into the middle, and that's it, cut. And you can pull that and nothing bad happens. This is what worries people about cutting the knitting. But this is sticky Shetland wool, so it's not going to pull apart. And you can see I've given that a good pull. And yeah, that one's come a bit loose now, but it's not a disaster because this is the edge of your bookmark here. So now I can work this flat, and I'm just going to finish the decrease row. And at the end of this row, I should be back down to 41 stitches. So it's 2 and 2 together. And I think I finish with 4, I hope. And so that's me ready to knit the top, and this will be 3 rows of moss stitch again. So now I've got the 3 rows of moss stitch done, and I'm casting off with the right side facing. It doesn't have to be the right side facing, but doing it this way means that you have you go straight from casting off to picking up the side. So I'm casting off in pattern, so I'm going to do a purl. And for the cast off, I'm doing it fairly loosely. I'm not tightening the stitch to the needle. And I'm leaving a gap between the 2 stitches as well, so that it doesn't get too tight, and that's a purl. You can see I'm leaving a good gap between the stitches, more than when I'm knitting. So this is the casting off. This is the easiest cast off. And there are other methods, and I don't use many of them. Now this is the last stitch, and I want to keep this stitch on the needle because I'm going to use the same yarn to pick up stitches along this edge. And for this I use a really thin needle. This is maybe 1.5 millimeters, So this is stitch number 1, and then I just poke in here to get number 2. And again, this is it's a bit tricky, but you just have to keep pulling at it, and I'll go in here for number 3. And then when this is the edge of the steek here, so this is your steek here, and this is the main body. Now the way that I like to do it is go into the centre of your body stitch and out through its next door neighbour. That way you're catching both colours, and I pick up a stitch for every row. This is the plain row, the one colour row, so both I'm catching are the same colour. And so I go in through the centre of one stitch and out through the centre of its neighbour. And I find this is the easiest way. And when the steek has been cut, then it naturally curls at about the right place. So you're going in through a light and out through a dark here, and here we are at the bottom where it's the single colour row. When you're doing a single colour row, you don't carry the unused colour, you just knit with the single colour. And then I think I'm going to pick up, this is where the steek was cast on, so I'm picking up there, and then I'll pick up some of this, something here, and that's 1 and 2, and it's a bit tricky, and this is why a really thin needle helps. And I'll just pick into that corner, and then you have to remember to put your big needle in. Sometimes, if I was doing a cardigan, I would probably have a smaller needle for the moss stitch, but for this it's easier just to have one. Now I'm going to purl this row. I don't purl very often, but this is purl 2 and 2 together, because it's actually easier to purl 2 together than it is to knit them. Well, it is if you're using the yarn in your right hand. I find it very, very difficult with the yarn in my left hand. Again, I think it's because everything is pulling in the same direction. So it's 2 and 2 together. And this should leave an odd number of stitches. If it doesn't, well, it's not a big piece of knitting to start the next row with a purl. So I'm just going to do a knit 1, purl 1. And it's really not important enough to stop and count the number of stitches here. Well, I must have an even number because I've ended it with a purl stitch, which means I have to start the next row with a purl. And to match the start, I'm just going to do 3 rows again of a moss stitch or a seed stitch edging. So this is row 2. So that's the third row, and I'm just going to cast this off. And then you have to do the same with the other side. Oh, I forgot, that needs to start with a purl. That's why I usually always have an odd number. And again, I'm casting this off fairly loosely. And this time, when I've got to the last stitch, I have nothing to do with this stitch, so I just break the yarn and pull it through, and that's that side finished. When you come to this end, pick up here, again it's the thin needle, and you go into the cast on edge, and you just need a bit of brute force to push into what you want, and catching the stitch is the tricky bit. Once you've caught it, it's fine. And you go in again into this little bit here. With moss stitch, there's a convenient little bit that points out the way. And now we've got to the steek. So I'm picking up, this is where it was cast on, so the two yarns the same colour. But this is the edge of the body, and then this is the steek stitch next door. So you're again picking up a stitch for every row. And that looks a lot neater than picking up 3 out of 4. And if you're using a really thin needle to do this, you're not really adding any height to the knitting, and you don't notice that you've got more stitches in this row than you have higher up. But it can look quite unattractive if you are picking up odd numbers of stitches from the edge. It's just neater to pick up 1 for every row. And then you just do the decrease row and then the moss stitch to match this side. So this is the last stitch that I'm going to take off here, and I just pull the end through. Now we're left with this little bits here that need to be tidied up, and this is, you remember where the colour changes happened, so I just cut off any excess at both sides, and it's just trimming these down. I think I should have had sharper scissors, but never mind. Now this end here, this is where I started. I'm just going to slide that up in the middle. And this end here, I'm going to use just to tidy up this edge. And I'm just using the needle to persuade those little ends to go underneath. So it's just a case of putting the needle through and then slip stitching to the reverse, and this just tidies the whole thing up. And it's just a few stitches, just enough to hold it down, and there's one peeping out there. So I'm just going to shove it in behind and put another stitch on top, and then get rid of this end in the middle and trim that off. And here with this end, it's just a case of making it disappear. And I'll just go down here until it lands in the middle of this stick too, and give it a pull and trim off the end. And then you have to do the same with this one. And there's an end here to use. If possible, you always use available ends. It's just less finishing to do. And this doesn't have to be that perfectly done. With time, the yarns all just sort of stick together quite well. And again, you just get this yarn to disappear. And because this is sticky yarn, you don't need to take as much care as you would with a slippy silk or something. And again here, I'm just going to get this thread to go down and then bring it out here. So when it's finished, it does curl up a bit. So the next step is to get it pressed. And you can either wash it and pin it, or else you can just press it. And I'll show you how to do that now. To press it, I use a damp cotton cloth and lay that on top. When it's curly, it might be better to do it this side. And make sure it's flat. With a really hot iron, and press it down. You don't smooth it. And press again on the bit you missed. And that's it flattened out. I'll just give it another press on this side just to make extra sure. And that's it, ready to use. Well, thank you for watching, and I hope you've learned a little something, and you can go and make your own bookmark. If you can make a bookmark, you can also make something much bigger like a cardigan, because the same rules apply when it comes to using a stick and cutting your knitting and picking up stitches. If you do want to learn a little more, I've made a couple of DVDs which are available from Jamieson and Smith. And they give you lots more information that I haven't had time to include today. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.